welcome you all. My name is Christina Hickey, and I'm with the Child Abuse Prevention Council of Contra Costa County. I'm the Community Education Coordinator, and though I do various things, my main role here is to conduct mandated reporter trainings for mandated reporters. And I'll let Jamie introduce herself. She is our co-presenter.
I'm Jamie Recky, and I am a social worker for the county. I am actually in our Resource Family Approval Unit. I do have 22 years in the field as a worker working with the children. I was a recruiter for a while when I first came to the county, and now I'm licensing homes, and was very excited to be a part of this training collaborative with Christina.
Yeah, we normally I do basic mandated reporter, what we call 101 for mandated reporters. But I thought that what I've noticed in my 17 years of experience doing this is that mandated reporters had a lot of questions about children and family services, and their misconceptions were creating some barriers to reporting suspected child abuse. So I approached Children and Family Services in Contra Costa County, and we came up with what we're calling Mandated Reporter Training 102. So I'm going to do a brief overview before we launch into the Mandated Reporter Training 102, just kind of a refresher to put us all on the page, and then we'll launch into that other training. Now, you should have received or will be receiving from Family Justice Center not only audience copies of the 2 PowerPoints you'll be seeing today, but also training materials that when we're live, I would be giving out to each audience participant. So again, if you have any questions, please type them into chat box. Shannon will be monitoring for us. My goal today, our goal, is to teach you something new or remind you of something that you may have forgotten or help you understand something you had questions about. And as we get started, I just want to say, we have, it looks like 39 participants. Statistically speaking, one of us, if not more than one of us, has been the victim of some form of child abuse in their life. So I want to acknowledge that. This training may press some buttons for you. Please practice self-care. If your buttons are pressed, turn off your camera, hug your dog, walk around the room, open a window. And as tough a topic as this is, the reason that we're all here is if we can prevent child abuse from happening to a child, that's the purpose. But please do take care of yourselves in any way that feels comfortable to you. And so now I'm going to share my screen and do this and do slideshow and from the beginning. Okay, so I think because you're covering up the slide, I'm just gonna, there we go. Okay. So I would like to know at this point, and so Shannon, can you launch our first poll? How many of you have ever filed a suspected child abuse report in your life? And these polls, by the way, are anonymous. No one's going to know who answered what, just so you know. All right, so we have, it's interesting, all of you that respond, most of you have indeed made a child abuse report. So that's interesting to know. And so thank you. All right. Okay, so in our overview, something that I've begun covering is cultural sensitivity. we know that child abuse crosses all socioeconomic, cultural, and religious boundaries. There is no status child abuser. What we do know is that it's overreported in some communities and underreported in others. UC Berkeley, their School of Social Science Research, has started keeping disparity statistics. They're in charge of the California Child Welfare Indicators Project. And what that is they keep statistics on child abuse and on child welfare issues for each county in California, and then the state as a whole. So it's a very interesting website. It's free. But what I'm going to quote to you now are statistics from Contra Costa County in 2021, so county-specific stats. And what they discovered in this report from 2021 is that African-American families were 3.56 times more likely to be reported for the same type of child abuse than white children. And Latino children were 1.56 times more likely to be reported for the same type of abuse as white children. And that's a disparity that can be explained. I mean, there's many reasons for the disparity. It could be that certain families come into contact with more government agencies, more mandated reporters. Poverty influences those statistics, but we can't discount that bias in reporting is a factor in these disparity reports. And so I just want to stress, no one culture is right about child rearing. Everyone comes to it from their own history. You know, the way that we were raised and the way we may have raised our children is not the definitive, most positive way or the right way to raise a child. So we do need to be culturally sensitive. And what's looked at when a report is made, and you should look as mandated reporters, what is the intention of the parent? What is the effect on the child? A different child rearing practice doesn't mean it's abusive if it's not something you would do. It doesn't necessarily, like, what is the intention of the parent in that traditional practice and what is the effect on the child? So as an example, I'll give you an example. A preschool director told me this story recently. She had a child's parents come to her and say, we want to report one of the children in your class for being a victim of sexual abuse. So the director said to her, well, you know, what makes you think that that child's being sexually abused? And they said, well, that child told our daughter that she being 5, bathes with her 3-year-old brother. And we think that's sexually abusive and is unacceptable. And so I ask you, a 5 and a 3-year-old bathing in the tub, playing, splashing around. You know, I've got 3 grandchildren, all 3 of them are in the tub at the same time. You know, is that abuse? And you have to, so that's just an example of the kind of things that, like, CFS may get a report, and Jamie, I'm poaching the pit bull story. People will call CFS and say, I want to report child endangerment. And okay, why do you want to report that? Well, because they have a pit bull. Well, has the pit bull attacked the child? Well, no. Does the child seem afraid of the pit bull? Well, no, we just think pit bulls are dangerous. Is that child abuse? So those are the kinds of things that and of course, when it comes to race, it gets even deeper than that. But we need to check our bias at the door. That's the point of what I'm trying to tell you. Check your bias at the door and think about that family in their own context. One of the things that is well studied is what makes for strong and healthy families. And these are the 5, what are called the 5 protective factors. How does a family manage stress and adversity? Does the family have social connections and networks to get emotional support, reason out how to solve problems, people to help out? It's also an opportunity for parents to help out other parents, which is very healthy for families. Concrete support, resources to meet their basic needs. If this family is poor, not abusive, just poor, how can we meet their needs through resources? It's important for families to have knowledge of parenting and child development, so that if you tell your 2-year-old not to touch something, and they touch something, you would know that it's a 2-year-old's job to touch everything. And you need to redirect them more than once. And you shouldn't look at them as I told you not to do that, and be punitive. A 2-year-old's not going to remember that you told them once. It's through constant modeling and redirection of the behavior that we're going to teach those children. So if you know child development, you're not going to say, oh, you're so naughty, whack. And then the social and emotional competence of children within the family. And that's a lot about early relationships with relatives, with friends, consistent caring adults that care for that child like you do, so that they're forming relationships with others in addition to those in the family. So in your packets of information that you will be sent, there is much better explanation than these bullet points on the protective factors. And there's also a sheet for mandated reporters. And this is where I want to introduce you to the term mandated supporters. We can help prevent child abuse by supporting families in advance. And anything we do that reduces the stress in a family's life is a step in the right direction of child abuse prevention. So in your packets, we have concrete ideas on how can you encourage and foster these protective factors with the families you work with, or just your social network and the people that you know. So what are you required to report? Now, there are other categories of child abuse, but those are assigned by Children and Family Services or law enforcement. As mandated reporters, you would be reporting neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and emotional abuse. And here again, in your packets of information on the side of signs and symptoms, there is a much deeper dive into the signs and symptoms for all of these types of abuse. Emotional abuse of all the abuses is the hardest to prove in and of itself. And as a matter of fact, in the Child Abuse and Neglect Reporting Act that governs California child abuse law, it says you must report neglect, you must report physical abuse, you must report suspected sexual abuse. It says you may report emotional abuse if severe. So the biggest hallmark for emotional abuse would be what the, let's see, let me get rid of this, would be change in behavior. The other ones are a little more obvious and you can read more about them. I'm kind of passionate about emotional abuse because the incidents of it are rising, and because it's the hardest to prove alone. And can't we all agree there's an emotional component to all of these abuses? It's just really hard. And, if you decimate a child's self-esteem because you're not the pretty one, you're the ugly one, or you look like your father and I hated your father, like those kinds of comments, what's really hard is a child's behavior and response to all of that may not occur until they're like in their adolescence. And then all of a sudden they have a behavior problem. So one can, in effect, and we know from brain scan technology that, trauma, but emotional abuse also can cause the neurological pathways of the brain to develop differently. So in effect, you're causing a biological change. It's almost, I would say, but it's not, what the authorities think, but I could almost say emotional abuse because of that brain change is physical because it's altering the brain. But, as I said, I will freely say that's my opinion. but that's not what the law says. So if you have a child that you're observing and they are like having suicidal ideation or depression, and if you can talk to them and they can disclose to you what's going on, you may find yourself making a report of emotional abuse. Oh, the other thing I want to tell you, so these are Contra Costa statistics provided by UC Berkeley. General neglect is the most often reported type of abuse, not only in Contra Costa County, but in California and the nation as a whole. And it's anywhere from 66 to 70% of all suspected child abuse reports are in this category. The next one is physical abuse. And then we have sexual abuse is number 3, at least this year, and emotional abuse is number 4. And the increase in the last year, what I'm hearing from my colleagues at Children and Family Services in the screening unit, those are the people that take your calls, is what they're seeing is emotional abuse being reported due to unrealistic parental expectations of children. You know, children who have every moment of their life is planned. The parents are planning for college and kindergarten. They have them enrolled in all of these activities, and then, you know, and these kids are suffering from the burden, or if they don't get an A+ in an advanced placement class in high school, you know, and the parents are angry with them for that. And so they're seeing this pressure on children to succeed in certain communities. The other incidents that has been raising the amount of reports is parents using their children as pawns in their divorce, either talking badly about each other, or call your father, he's late on the child support, or making accusations. So we're seeing an increase in nasty divorces emotionally affecting children more than just the child being sad that his parents are breaking up. All right, so what is not abuse? We talk a lot about what is abuse, but it's important for you to know what is not considered abuse. Poverty alone with no other risk factors. If a family is poor, it's not their intention not to provide the necessities of life for their child. Now, if a family is poor because whatever money the parents have, they are feeding some kind of an addiction like gambling, or they are, or drugs and alcohol, that's different because they can provide and are not providing. It's when a family is just poor. Homelessness, similar situation. Homelessness in and of itself is not considered child abuse. Now, you can still call Children and Family Services if you want to discuss the situation and try to get the family resources. We want to help those families. But is it child abuse? It's not the intention of the parent. Certain cultural practices would be the most common, and there's a sheet in your packets detailing more, but the most common one would be coining or cupping, and it's an Eastern curative method. The parents are not inflicting pain on the child. It's a curative thing. And in some cultures, it's also a religious thing where they invoke memories of ancestors to help in the healing process. But basically, a cup is heated up and placed on this child's skin, creates a vacuum. And the idea is to release toxins, but it leaves ring marks. And so you might see a child, those of you that may remember Michael Phelps in the Summer Olympics a million moons ago now, he had rings all over him. And it is Eastern medicine. It's not evil in intent. And it's not like a parent punching a child and leaving a bruise. It leaves ring marks due to the suction. Spanking is considered a cultural custom also, and it is allowable in the state of California, but you're not allowed to leave a mark on your child. That's where the line gets crossed. And then slapping absolutely is not codified as a cultural practice. And that would be looked at on an individual basis, but slapping a young child is absolutely needs to be looked into because of brain development. You know, if you slap a child often enough, hard enough, and their brain is not fully developed in the skull and it's banging around in there, you can cause like blindness, seizures. And if it's done often enough, like shaking a baby is a similar thing, the child could actually die. Religious practices, the one that comes most to mind is Christian Scientists who withhold medical intervention as part of their religion. But there's a caveat there. If that religious practice is going to cause harm, then they're not allowed to do it. So you might have a family where the child has a really bad cold and they're not going to give that child like Robitussin or Tylenol. They're allowed to do that. If it's something that the child's going to work out of their system on its own, that's when it's allowable. However, if the child needed an operation and the parents refused for religious reasons, that should be reported. Usually doctors would report that, and then intervention would occur. We can't let a religious practice harm a child. So also for you guys, and I don't know all your professions, but if you have to subdue a child who is a danger to themselves or others, like in a classroom or in a practice or an after-school program, you would not be considered physically abusing that child if you had to keep them or others safe. Truancy in and of itself with no other risk factors is not considered child abuse. That's a school attendance review board issue, and they're mandated reporters. So when they investigate why is the child truant and go to the home or talk to the family, they may come to reasonable suspicion because truancy is a risk factor. They could come to reasonable suspicion and make the report. But if you were to call Children and Family Services and say this child's been absent like 40 days since the beginning of the school year, that's not, I mean, by law they have to take your report, but that's not something that rises to legal level that they need to engage in. But do remember, truancy is a risk factor. It's just alone with no other risk factors, it's not considered abuse. A mutual fray between minors, like schoolyard fights, things like that, that's not considered child abuse. And then I see necessary force. So I've got this listed twice on this PowerPoint. I'll have to edit that. So moving right along. So here's the law.
Christina, there was a question in the chat.
Yes, what is it?
It asked, is spanking with a belt okay?
This is very tricky, and each circumstance would have to be looked at differently. If the law doesn't say you can't use an object, so spanking with a belt isn't isn't necessarily child abuse. It could be. When a parent spanks with their hand gets red, it gets hot, and most parents aren't spanking in a good mood. It's not generally one whack, don't cross the street or touch the hot stove. Parents are usually angry, and when you use your hand, you're going to get feedback to your brain. When you use a belt or an object, you're not going to get that feedback. So the likelihood of you're leaving a mark is greater. In one of the scenarios I use, you have a young girl telling her friend, my father hit me with a belt last night because I did X, Y, and Z wrong. But the child does not show any signs of injury. She's not squirming in her seat. She's telling her friend in a matter-of-fact kind of way, and she's happy to see her father when he picks her up. So there's been no change in her behavior. And so that is a tricky one. But people who use objects, and I do believe there are times, if there's other factors, the Children and Family Services might investigate when a child has been hit with an object. And Jamie, I'm going to invite you in. Do you have anything to share on that?
Well, we say belt. I was one of those kids that got spanked with a belt, always judiciously. It was preferable to my father's hand. But when we're talking about a belt, we're talking about the belt piece. Some of our kids come through because they've been hit with a belt, but with the buckle end. You can't say to me, when you use that end of the belt that you were just disciplining, because you know that buckle, especially the big heavy ones, is going to cause damage. So yeah, spanking is not illegal, but what we do know is that kind of corporal punishment works in the moment, but studies have shown that kids end up going underground more. They stop trusting their parents. There's better ways of working with your kid without resorting to corporal punishment. I always try to think of it as a last resort. Expectations and basically logical consequences can be just as effective, because you can't, using some so-called violence to stop a behavior only works for the short term, and studies have shown that to be true.
I have to jump in with a brief anecdote that was told to me by a social worker. He had 2 siblings, and they had a stepfather, and he's retired now. And he said his stepfather came home when remote controls were brand new on TVs. And he said to the 3 boys, I am the only one that is allowed to use the TV. So boys being boys, they watched the TV. The stepdad came home, put his hand on top of the TV. It was hot. And the social worker told me he beat us like bad. He really, really wailed on the 3 of us. And he said, you know what that taught me? Taught me how to lie. We knew when he came home every day. We watched that TV. And about a half hour before he came home, we put a tray of ice cubes on the top of the TV. And stepdad would come in, touch the TV, and feel like, yeah, I showed them. And this social worker told me, you know what it taught me to do was to lie. So do we encourage spanking? No, absolutely not. And most people, unless you're a daycare provider changing diapers or a medical professional, you're not going to see whether or not a child has a mark on their buttocks. And the only way you could tell is if the child couldn't sit still, was squirming, was afraid when their parents showed up. It's a real, and we're going to talk about questions you can ask children. You know, you might have to, you seem really uncomfortable. What's going on with you today? And then they may disclose what happened. And then you may want to make a report because the child is clearly uncomfortable. It's a wild one. There are some states that where spanking is not considered a cultural custom for discipline, and it's not allowed at all. And there are many countries in the world that have outlawed that as well. I'm going to go over the highlights of the Child Abuse and Neglect Reporting Act, but I want you to know that in your packets of information, in the attachment that says the law, there's a document I call the 4 Ps, and it has everything you need to know about this law in easy to read English. But next to everything that I've said, I've put the penal code reference. So if you wanted to look at the letter of the law, you'd know where to go. So right now, there are 49 categories. It keeps growing. People who employ children at Disneyland now are mandated reporters. If you have more than X amount of employees or X amount of employees under 18, now they've become mandated reporters. So they keep adding. Basically, anyone who is paid, there's a few exceptions, but anyone paid to work with children is a mandated reporter. Volunteers are not considered mandated reporters, which is a shame in a way, because there's a lot of volunteers in school districts that work with children, develop relationships with children, and they're advised to be trained, but they're not required to report. So next poll question. You'll notice on this list, clergy members have an asterisk. So Shannon, can you launch poll number 2? Why do clergy members have this asterisk marked next to their profession? All right, Shane, we can end the poll now in the interest of time. Most of you were right. They are not always required to report suspected child abuse. And the problem there is it has resulted in all of these lawsuits. So what is the story with clergy? They are required to report suspected child abuse when they're running a youth sports program or working with youth. When they're in penitential conference, meaning, and this is any faith, someone of their faith comes to them to confide in them, they can say to the clergy member, I am abusing my child, and that clergy member does not have to disclose that. And it seems crazy to me, but it's also it's to preserve that confidentiality between clergy and member of that faith. There have been attempts to get rid of that for the longest time, but it still stands to this day that they only have to report when they're working with youth outside of a penitential conference. Okay, so let's go. All right, so the most important thing you need to know is that suspected child abuse is an individual responsibility. A mandated reporter is not off the hook if they say, oh, the principal, I'll tell the principal, they'll make the report and walk away. That mandated reporter, I mean, the law does allow for the principal to make the report, for example, for a teacher. That is allowable. Children and Family Services always want to speak with the person with the firsthand knowledge of the suspected abuse, not getting it secondhand through the principal, for example. But it's allowable. But that teacher must make sure that that principal made the report. If you are in a situation where an employer says to you, I'll make that report, if you can't verify that it was done, like maybe you're intimidated by that person. Maybe that person didn't want you to make the report in the first place because they played golf with the kid's parents. There's all sorts of reasons why some people want to suppress reports, reputation of the schools or of the agency. But that doesn't mean that the mandated reporter can say, well, they should have. So my recommendation is, if you have firsthand knowledge and you're not making the report, if you can't sit in on the phone call or ask the person who made the report, can I have a copy of your written report that accompanies the phone call? If whatever the reason you're intimidated to do that, don't worry about it. Pick up the phone and make a report again. Due to confidentiality, CFS is not going to tell the principal that, oh, Susie Q made the report. That's against the law for them to reveal the identity of the mandated reporter. And please understand that that person can't call Children and Family Services and say, did my employer make a report? To protect your employer's confidentiality and the child's confidentiality, they cannot reveal to you whether or not that person made a report. But the thinking is better 2 reports be made on the same child for the same, for the same incident than no reports at all. And about 2014, Contra Costa County had 4 or 5 big lawsuits against them for failure to report suspected child abuse. They paid out over $50 million, Contra Costa County. And the common denominator in all of those lawsuits was someone told someone else, and the person said they'd take care of it. They didn't take care of it. And the mandated reporter didn't realize that it was a personal responsibility. And so it was a very expensive year for Contra Costa County. So, yes,
Christina,
yeah,
I just wanted to share, we had a comment in the chat, and that was, we do read cases in the news about clergy being abusive. This is hard to believe.
I know. And we, as a prevention agency, I can't tell you, and I've been doing this for 17 years, how many efforts have been made to change that. I mean, I can't imagine listening to a parent say, I'm sexually abusing my daughter. And the guy gives, like, I grew up Catholic, so I'll use that as a reference, like 10 Hail Marys. How do you forgive something like that, especially if it's ongoing, and not do something? So I don't know. It's, and with all these scandals and failure to report, I just don't understand how it has gotten, how they've gotten away with it. But the law hasn't changed, and the faith-based community has a lot of power in Sacramento.
We have one other question, Christina.
Sure.
What if the abuser has his own volunteer teen group? Since he is the president of this group, is he responsible to be a mandated reporter?
He is volunteering.
I'll repeat the question. If the abuser has his own volunteer teen group, since he's the president of this group, is he responsible to be a mandated reporter?
If it's volunteers are not mandated reporters, as I had mentioned earlier, which is something that we would like to see change too. Like if you're working with youth and you're getting close to them, they could confide in you and you can observe them. I'd like to see that volunteers who work with youth become mandated reporters. I'd like to see babysitters become mandated reporters. But anyway, if the abuser has like a volunteer youth group, he doesn't charge any money, he's not getting paid, technically he's not a mandated reporter. But I think the question is, and he is abusing those children?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
then we have to hope to empower those children to speak up for themselves, to make a report, or to tell their parents. We got to encourage communication and child safety to parents. You want a relationship with your child that, you know, he's in a volunteer group of youth, and that he is empowered to speak up when he is uncomfortable in any way, you know, whether it's physical or sexual or even emotional. Sometimes, like, you know, coaches, like baseball coaches, can cause emotional distress on the kids that they work with. But no, that person's not a mandated reporter. And in a case like that, we can only hope that the youth, someone in that group, would speak up if abuse was occurring.
I think that as parents, because I know when my son was young, because of the work I do, I started at a very early age talking to him about what's appropriate for any person who is interacting with my child, including myself, because he's a boy, I'm a girl. When there was bath time, or, you know, I always asked him if it was okay, because you want to respect your children, and you talk to them about what's appropriate touch. You also have to remind your children that sometimes abusers will threaten them or your parents, which will keep kids quiet. But I always told my son, your mother is like a mama bear, and don't worry about anyone coming to hurt her. You just tell me everything. And it really builds the basis for a solid relationship between parents and children. And it will help our children understand when they do have this happen to them, because sometimes kids don't know. I've worked with kids that they really didn't know that certain things were wrong. So we have to teach them how to identify that, speak up, because what we do know too is a lot of times the abusers will go to a child that they know won't speak up or speak out. So teach your children to speak their mind and go straight to you when they're feeling like someone's doing something that makes them uncomfortable.
Yeah, we at the Child Abuse Prevention Council have a program called Speak Up, Be Safe. And we go into the schools and we teach children how to keep themselves safe, how to identify a safe adult. And the safe adult they pick signs a contract that they will list, that they are someone who has agreed that the child can go to. And it's kind of sad sometimes how children will not pick their parents out as the safe adult. They'll pick a teacher or the lunch lady. But we're teaching them about the tricks that perpetrators use. And when I train parents, I talk to them about signs they should be looking for within their social network. All parents are so afraid of stranger danger. And do we need to keep our children safe from strangers? Absolutely. It happens 10% of the time. But 90% of the time, the child knows who the abuser is. Mostly it's from within their family. And then it may be like neighbor, coach, teacher, someone that they know from some association. This program, when we brought it to the schools, kids just started disclosing. And one of the things that we started making a lot of reports. And one of the things about sexual abuse to point out is that, yeah, you can read about the signs and symptoms, but disclosure is the most often way we learn about child sexual abuse. And given that the child is threatened with, I'm going to hurt your sister or your family, they are so ashamed and they are so afraid that they don't often disclose. So for all the statistics we have on sexual abuse, it's considered that only a third of sexual abuse is ever reported. And usually it comes from disclosure. And one time the kids may come forward is when the perpetrator has moved on to a younger sibling, and where they wouldn't stick up for themselves, they will for a younger sibling and come forth. And and Nicole, I'm definitely going to answer your question in 1 second. I just want to finish up with, if a child ever discloses sexual abuse to you, run, do not walk to the phone and make a suspected sexual abuse report, because studies show 99% of the time when a child discloses sexual abuse, they're telling the truth. It's a very hard thing for a child to do. And if they have that courage, then you must believe them. There's only, and people say to me, well, how do we know if they're fibbing? Statistically, they're not. You don't want to roll the dice that this is the one kid out of 99 are telling the truth. You don't want to roll the dice on maybe the kid is fibbing. It just statistically doesn't make sense. So, and Nicole, what is your question?
There we go. Hi. Hopefully
Hi.
you guys can hear me clearly. So I know that you guys were talking about educating, younger children and educating. I just wanted to bring up that, a longtime friend of mine who was molested by her maternal grandfather, and she did tell her parents or her mother, and her mother had told her not to tell her father. And at the end of the story, it was really because the mother had also been molested by her father. My friend also has a book that is out currently that's in Barnes and Nobles and Amazon, and it's actually a children's book. And this children's book is called Tell Somebody. It's a colorful book that will teach children how to protect themselves against potential abuse. It's actually teaching children the warning signs and to encourage them to tell somebody if they are being abused.
Good. Thank you for, I'm going to look that book up. It really is, when I train parents, I'm like, you've got to be looking for like the most charming person, you've got to be looking, you know, so you've got to be looking at who's spending a little bit more time with your kid, or a person who spends more time with kids than with adults. There's a whole list of things to look out for. So when I train parents, I go into that. You know, yeah, teach your child's stranger danger, safety, but like you really need to look at who is in your life. And it's quite sad that in a case like that, this child's being betrayed not only by grandpa, but by mom. And yet, do we have compassion? Because oh, mom was molested too, and you should never, ever, and we teach kids this, don't ever let anyone tell you, anyone, to keep a secret from a parent. That is just wrong. You know, and we teach them the difference between secrets and surprises. And
yeah, it's a really good book, and like I said, it's really the basic. It's telling the children, you know, what is a safe touch, what should they not do, and like I said, it really is kid friendly. That she does do different outreaches and events and tells her story, and it's something that is not out. I try to look up other books to kind of educate young children just on the basics of what is appropriate and what is not appropriate, and right. I can't find anything else.
We have at our agency, and if you're interested, my contact information is at the back, but we have booklets. It's called Straight Talk, and it comes in, and this is for parents to how to foster that kind of a relationship, what language to use with their children. So it's Straight Talk. It comes in English and Spanish. There's an English only version for children with disabilities because they're even more vulnerable, especially if they're not verbal. And then there's a booklet called The 10 Conversations. And it like with young children, you know, the thinking is you start early, often, and briefly, age appropriate. You don't like, it's like when your child, a 3-year-old says, where do babies come from? You don't go into the whole biological lesson. You might say from mommy's womb. These are really good booklets. We're updating them and getting more published for distribution. We kind of ran out of, we still have some left, and I've got PDF I can send, but it's really good to have for parents because they don't necessarily know what to do. And this is such a great guideline. So please let me know if you want, and I will make sure you get it. All right, so now how do you report? In Contra Costa County, you only are going to report to Children and Family Services as they're known here. In other counties, they're also known as Child Protective Services. Contra Costa changed their name a long time ago. Yeah. Or law enforcement. With law enforcement, you're going to want to call the police department where the child resides. So for example, you might be working with the child in Contra Costa, but they live in Alameda. It would be investigated by the police where the child lives. Now, you may not know that. So you can call 911 and they will steer you to the right department. It just cuts out a step if you have the local police department that you can call and you can say, I'd like to speak with a special victims unit detective, someone with expertise. So that's just a suggestion. But don't hesitate. Don't if that detective isn't around, don't wait for him to call you back. Then you'd want to call 911 or you'd want to call Children and Family Services. You don't want to waste time on it, but just a hint, it would be better if you could find someone who actually does child abuse investigations. After you make your phone call, you need to follow up in writing. And you're going to send your paperwork to whoever you called. Call law enforcement, you're going to send them the form that's going to be on the next screen. You call Children and Family Services, you're going to send it to them. Ask them when you make your phone call, how best can I get it to you? And they will tell you, do you have a fax machine? Yeah, fax it over. Or they may say, can you send it as an attachment? In Contra Costa, up until COVID, you could not send the form as an attachment. You could only fax it or mail it. But with COVID, people working from home, people didn't have fax machines at home. So they started allowing for electronic submission. But I can't, in your packets, I have like the phone numbers for CFS and their fax numbers. But I don't know the email of every social worker at the screening unit. I don't know the emails for, in Contra Costa, we have 26 separate police jurisdictions. So better just to ask them, how would you like me to get you my paperwork? This is the form. Don't be intimidated by the things you may not know. You may not know that where the other siblings of the child you're calling on go to school. Fill it out to the best of your ability. One of the things they really like to know is what is the home language of the family, because they will not use a child as a translator. So if you know that their home language is Spanish, it's very helpful. That way they'll send a social worker who speaks their language, or they'll use a translation line. Another suggestion, fill out this form before you make your phone call, because every question on this form is going to be what they ask of you. You can get this form online. The web link is in your training packets. If you can send it online, it's great. You can fill it out and then you save it, and then you can send it as an attachment. The narrative box you'll see right there at the bottom, like that's teeny weeny. If you have more to say, add a second sheet. If 3 of you observe the same type of abuse, that little box only has room for 1 name. Add a second sheet saying all 3 mandated reporters present. Like if a child were to disclose to 3 of you at once, that way you also all cover yourselves. And the social workers may want to speak to the other individuals. So that's a helpful hint. And if you fill this out first, you make your phone call, then you fax or email it or mail it, your obligation under the law has been satisfied. All of the fines and penalties are listed in that section that I referred to as the 4 Ps, but basically you get the point. This is a misdemeanor. The maximum financial fine would be $1,000. Maximum jail time would be 6 months. It depends on the circumstances and the judge as to how much of each of those you would get. But be advised, if they can prove that you should have reported and you failed to report, you would lose your legal immunity. I mean, right now, as mandated reporters, if you make a good faith report, you have immunity from legal liability. But what if you fail to report and say the parents are divorced? The non-offending parent could sue you and you will have lost your legal immunity because you haven't reported. Does that even, yes. Yeah, if you report, you have legal immunity. If you don't report, you don't. So other things could happen to you for failure to report. You could be involved in a nuisance lawsuit, not a nuisance lawsuit. Oh my God, I'm blanking on the name for lawsuits that are, oh my goodness gracious, it'll come back to me. But basically, we're not talking about like a felony here, but there are consequences for failure to report. And if you have a license, your licensing agency, if they catch wind that you're under investigation because you failed to report suspected child abuse, they may yank your license. What are your protections? Confidentiality. There's a $500 fine and up to 6 months in county jail for anyone who reveals your identity. So that your employer can't do it, the social worker, law enforcement, they're not allowed to reveal your name. Now, having said that, parents sometimes can figure out who made the report. If your child only goes to preschool and you live on a ranch and your neighbors aren't close by, and you know, you might say, well, the only place it could have come from was the school. A child also may go home and say, I told my teacher what you did last night, and that child is not going to be given up to $500 and up to 6 months in county jail. So there's times when it may be obvious that it's you. Just know that the investigators can't say it's you. If the case were to go to court, you might be asked to testify, and then the lawyers would know at that point, could pretty well know, although your name should be redacted, who actually made the report, but you would be asked to testify to give corroborating evidence. And that's very rare. You do not have to tell your employer you're making a report. That is your decision to make. It is best practice that you do so. The family may approach them at wherever it is that you work. So best practice to let your employer or your supervisor know, yes. But ultimately, if you're intimidated or you think that they're going to try to suppress your report, you don't have to. And then you can't be penalized in any way for making a report in good faith. And you do have this immunity from lawsuits. All right. So obstacles to reporting. I'm only going to expound upon two. One, the one I hear the most often is fear the child will suffer as a result of the report. I can't promise you that that's not going to happen. It may happen that that child, when the parents find out, will take it out on that child. But what I can tell you is if you don't report, that child's going to be a victim for a lot longer. That child's going to be subjected to way more abuse than just the abuse that night because they're upset. So yes, it's a real fear. You don't want children to suffer, but failure to report is actually condemning them to more suffering. The other thing I want to mention is immigration and customs enforcement. With undocumented families, people hesitate to report child abuse because they think that the family is going to be deported. That is not the case. Senate Bill 54 was signed into law on October 5th, 2017, and it's the sanctuary state law. So that law enforcement or children and family services, when they receive suspected child abuse reports, they are not allowed to ask the status of the family. They can't say, well, where's your green card? Or you're here illegally. They're not allowed to call immigration and customs enforcement. So let's not let those undocumented children or children of undocumented families suffer, because we can help those families and they won't get deported. If the case goes to court and the person is found guilty and there's court records that are public, sometimes ICE will hang around the courthouse and they may find out that way, but it would have to have gone to that level before their names would be discovered. They'd have to be like guilty of sexual abuse or severe physical abuse, something along those lines. All right, here are the phone numbers. Yes, ma'am.
Sorry, we've got two questions in chat.
Okay.
The first one is historical reporting penalties / protections.
I'm not sure I understand. Historical
reporting penalties / protections. And then the next question is, what is the immigration status code?
Immigration status code?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to ask both of those people if they could unmute themselves, because I'm not sure I understand either question. Historical reporting. Can whoever asked that question, can you unmute yourself and explain what you're asking? Oh, maybe they.
She's not. She says that she is unable to mute.
Oh, to unmute. Okay, I don't know, Jamie. I mean, do those questions make? Do you understand?
Not necessarily. I was looking at it when I saw it come up. I don't know if it's speaking to how have things changed historically. That I think maybe in the beginning there weren't protections, and then over the years there are more protections. That's kind of the way I read it. And I don't know about an immigration status code. I was going to look it up because I've never heard of it.
Right, I can tell you that it's Senate Bill 54 that protects them, but you know, like the legal technicality on a code, I'm unaware of. If you want to, we need to kind of move on here, but if Vanessa, if those
Oh.
two, what?
There are some status codes, but that's not anything that we've utilized here in doing this. So they say there's codings like E22 is a spouse of an alien classified as an E21, E23 is a child of an alien. To my knowledge, and I'm not going to say it's expansive, those are visa categories. So I have not heard of that, and I don't know that we use it here. I just know that we do not ask people about their immigration status whenever.
Right, nor should law enforcement. You're not even allowed to ask about immigration status. And certainly you're not allowed to call.
H4 and H1B. Thank you, Arati. Yeah, we don't even, they do not come across our desk. We just treat children as children, regardless of where they're from or who their parents are. It's all the same.
So I think I had someone type maybe a clarifying statement. I think they are asking about if there are any specific protections or limitations while making a historical report, a report based on a previous event, not recent active threat.
All right, Jane, that sounds like a Jamie question.
I would say that a report is a report. So, because sometimes it's rare where you do have a child who talks about past reports. You make that report even though it was from the past, because the bottom line is they're disclosing, and that's how you treat it. And we've had kids who say, it kind of speaks to when a sibling all of a sudden is being abused, then that sibling comes forward and talks about their past abuse. It was in the past, you make the report. It's the same thing if a kid comes to you and says, this happened to me, but I told somebody. And maybe they say it happened 2 years ago and they told someone then, you still make the report. So bottom line, if a child comes to you and discloses anything, I mean, I know that even adults come back and disclose abuse from when they were younger. That's how those cases get into the news, is we're finding out that people are starting to open up. So anytime a child comes to you, whether it's today or 3 months ago or 3 years ago, you make that report.
Right. And the idea is don't let that kid fall through the cracks. It may be that the situation is resolved and the child's no longer in danger because the perpetrator no longer has access to that child. Or, there could be any range of circumstances. But if you don't know if it's been reported, it doesn't hurt, even if Children and Family Services can't go out 3 years after the fact. You want to get it into the history. And more importantly, you want to cover your own behind and just say, child disclosed the following to me. And you want, that way you're covered for your legal responsibilities, and let the professionals at Children and Family Services or law enforcement investigating, let them figure out all the other details.
It does provide us with our historical facts in our database. Sometimes people say, oh, you guys take kids at the drop of a hat. And sometimes if you look at when kids are finally detained, you see how many phone calls, how many visits to the home were made prior. It really is kind of a no-win situation, because we either pull them too fast or we don't pull them fast enough. And that's why we always try to explain to people, we have to meet that criteria of the welfare and institution codes. We can't just go in and pull kids. There's a legal process. And that's why some kids sometimes have, 11 referrals, but none of them hit that threshold. And then finally, the one day comes where we hit the threshold and then we detain.
I've got a hand raised.
Okay. whoever raised their hand, you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, and then we're going to get through because I noticed that we're at 11:15. And just know that we will, hopefully, if we get through this, we will have question and answers at the end of the PowerPoint. So I'm going to just go ahead and, oh, it's okay.
It's okay.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and get us rolling here. So
Okay.
this is the MRT section of what do you need to know. So this is kind of Children and Family Services telling you the second half of what Christina just talked about. So our objectives in this training are obviously to alleviate perceived barriers and obstacles to making that suspected child abuse report. Talk a little bit about the confidentiality and anonymity. I can't pronounce that word today. To understand what makes a good report, to get that better understanding of what our role is after that report is taken. And then at the end, we can answer frequently asked questions. So some of the key indicators about abuse in these areas: physical appearance. So physical appearance for our kids is that they have marks on their bodies that don't make sense, or they have a bruise where they say, well, I fell, but knowing, you know, dynamics of falling, the bruise is somewhere where you're like, no, that doesn't make sense. Cigarette burns, bite marks. These are definitely telling signs of something is going on. Their behavior, a child's behavior can tend to become more aggressive. They can become hypervigilant because they're scared of this person. They can have sleep issues. I had a child on my caseload that we were out and a white truck drove by, and I've never seen a kid's demeanor shift so rapidly. And her sister told me that's the kind of truck that the boyfriend of the mother drove, and he was torturing and tormenting these kids. So these are the things you want to look at. Definitely sleep issues. Sometimes kids might start sleepwalking. You have to kind of delve deeper into those. Family risk factors. So, you know, Christina kind of talked about this earlier. Poverty and homelessness, they are not crimes. You know, are they a risk factor of abuse? Yes, they can be. But in and of themselves, a family that is living in poverty, that's not one of those indicators. Now, if there's drug use that puts them and keeps them in poverty, that becomes a different story. The environmental risk factors. So for some of our kids, and this was big during the pandemic because we didn't have the schools. So our calls went down, except when it came to DB, because domestic violence kind of ran amok during the pandemic. And when the police went out to handle the domestic violence call, the kids were there and they came to us. Now that schools are opening up again, our ER department is insanely busy. Disclosure, the child actually comes to you and says, somebody's doing this to me. Always take that child seriously. Never make them feel like they did the wrong thing by telling you, because for kids to tell you that someone's harming them, especially when it's someone who loves them and they love them, that's a trust thing, and you never want to break a child's trust. And your gut feeling, you know, gut feelings, they've done studies on gut feelings, and they find that a large majority, over 80% of the time, your gut feeling is actually right. There's a reason that your stomach feels a certain way when you hear something or you see something. I know over the years, anytime that I've tried to ignore my gut feeling, it always ends up being correct. So I've learned to not ignore it anymore. And that's hard because nobody wants to think that someone is harming a child. It's just like nobody wants to think that 85% of our kids who come into care are here because of a family member. That's a tough nut. But we've got to start dealing with it. Okay.
I would like to say on this next slide, we developed this program. We've trained every employee in Brentwood Union School District. So please forgive all the references to schools. Just imagine where it is you work. Answer these questions around where it is you work. So go ahead, Jamie.
All right, so some of the considerations. What are you going to do if you're concerned, but the situation doesn't give you reasonable suspicion of child abuse? Anyone have any ideas? Want to throw out there? I think for me, when I think about this question, keep a watch, keep your eyes and ears open. If you know, but again, you only have to have suspicion. We're the ones that have to go out and investigate. You've got the hotline number at your disposal 24/7, and that's what they are there for, is to answer those questions. So make sure you make that phone call. How do you support the child at school after the report is made? You know, it goes back to just listening to them. Sometimes they'll come back to you to talk some more. Don't ask any more questions if you don't have to, because that's going to be our job. But listen to them, support them, find resources for them if it's needed. If they disclose further abuse, then you're making another report. So just be clear that if they come and say, well, this happened on one day, and then 3 days later they say, oh, well, this happened, and they're two different circumstances, you have to make the second report. What are the services and resources at your school? Sometimes families are struggling, and you know, in this society, it's not always easy to ask for help because we get a little judgy. But if you're at any kind of agency where you have people that need resources, my thought philosophy is have those resources out there where the families can get them, not necessarily by having to ask for them, because they need to be able to know that the resources are there and they can get them without having to actually say something to someone. But eventually they will. I think once they realize there are resources out there, it's a little bit easier. And as always, if you're just not sure, call the CFS hotline. We will answer all your questions. We can't tell you whether to make a report or not, but we can help you see if it rises to that level of concern. And always remember that you are, as the reporting party, always confidential. So our hotline, we are there 24/7, 365 days a year. We field thousands of calls. And the nice thing is for all the calls we field, thank God not all of them become cases. We have to take your report. Don't let anyone ever tell you they can't take your report, because it's your right. We will, during business hours, the CFS social workers answer calls. After hours, there is an answering service. Give them your name, your direct contact number, and the location of suspected abuse, and if you can, the name and date of birth of the child. Now, if you make that phone call and you're at work, that's why you want to think about you, because our after hours people are very busy. You're going to want to make sure that you have the direct line number or your cell phone. Print out your report that you filled out and take it home with you, because sometimes our after hours workers, they have to prioritize calls. They might not call you till later. So make sure you print out your report and bring it home with you.
I would just like to add that if you call after hours and you get the answering service, you would leave your name, your phone call. If you have the name of the child, that information, but don't give the answering service the whole story, like what the child said to you. Because the social worker, when they call you back, is going to be asking you the same question. That way you don't have to repeat yourself. And oftentimes I've been told by after-hours social workers that the story that they get from the answering service doesn't always match the conversation they had with the mandated reporter. So just save yourself the effort and just give like the basic information for them to call you back.
All right. So again, complete the suspected child abuse report, or SCAR. We like to abbreviate everything. Do it before you make the phone call, because as Christina said earlier, they're going to ask you those same questions. And if you're not sure what to put down, that's okay too. I remember the first time I did a suspected child abuse report. It's daunting, but I called the hotline and they were so helpful, and it just made it seem so much easier. Blank spaces always kind of unnerve people, but I mean, the questions are all really relevant and they're very straightforward, and you just have to go down the line. The most important thing is that phone number where we can reach you, the name, date of birth, and the location of the child. You can't say, you know, this is this kid, but I'm not sure where he's at, because if we can't find the child, we can't do an investigation. So we need all of that information from you when the reports are made. If multiple reporters are involved, only one needs to make the report, though agency policy may dictate otherwise, but whoever those three people are, all three people need to make sure that whoever you designated to make that report makes the report. Because it doesn't bode well, as we heard for Contra Costa County, and Penn State is always my go-to. You know, the guy at Penn State said, oh, I had my boss do it, the boss never did it. That's not going to fly. You have to be responsible to ensure that report gets to us.
I'd like to point out to another, for you to provide your personal phone number. So let's use schools as an example. You call CFS to make a suspected child abuse report, and then the social worker calls back, but they get the front office secretary, and there's parents hanging around behind her, and people coming and going, and children. And then she'll take your information and pass on the message. It's like a big delay. It would be best, even if you can't answer your cell phone because you're working at that moment, it would be best to provide a direct number for the social worker to talk to you, to not only protect your anonymity, because like the school secretary might say, oh, Ms. Johnson, she's teaching right now. Oh, who are you from social services? And people can put two and two together. So for the confidentiality of the child and your own, that's another reason to provide a direct number so that you don't have people overhearing.
Correct.
Okay,
right.
I don't, let me get the next. Okay.
All right, so the emergency response. So we make the report and it's determined that it merits further investigation, which is either an immediate, which means we're going out that day as soon as possible, or we have what is the 10-day. So those aren't as time sensitive. That social worker makes contact with the children, the parents, and any third parties involved. They will contact the reporting party if they need any additional details. They go out to the home, and one of the first things they're looking at, is there an immediate safety threat? Is there any likelihood that there's going to be some maltreatment? They do all this assessment, and then when they're ready, they determine if the child needs to be detained because of that immediate threat to safety. When we go out to the homes, we're looking at this as what has happened. We really try not to look at what's wrong with this family. We want to just know what has happened. And that goes back to, in this field, you have to check your bias every day. This is a really tough field to work in because there's a lot of good in it, but you know, you see a lot of hard stuff. So you always want to make sure that you check that bias, and if you come from what has happened, then you're dealing with the facts. Because again, remember, we're talking about meeting a legal standard, not a, well, I just think. That's not what we're here for. We want to look at facts. If the child has an immediate safety threat, we're going to detain. If the worker feels the child is safe, they won't detain, but that doesn't mean that we might not offer them services, because the county does have other services to provide for children and families that doesn't always require the child to be detained. because we really do want to help families not have to go through this system. But sometimes we have no choice.
No, a great example one of our colleagues gave about priorities for an ER worker. In fact, I think she is an ER worker. She said, after like domestic violence, and we're going to talk more about that later, must be reported as suspected child abuse if the child is aware or witness to. So we'll talk about that later. But say the social worker gets a report of domestic violence where the child was witness. But then she finds out that the offending parent has been jailed, that there's a protective order in place, and that that child is now safe. That might take a back seat to a disclosure of sexual abuse or physical abuse that is in the present, in the now.
Yeah.
So they have to do like they do in hospitals, triage based upon, is this child safe?
Yes, which is why if you make a report, say at 4:30 or 4:45 in the afternoon, you might not get a call from the after-hours social worker till 10 or 11 o'clock at night, because sometimes they're running from the minute they start at 5 all the way through the evening, and they have to prioritize which calls warrant the immediate investigation. So there we go. So what does the emergency response social worker need from you? Well, again, they might call and ask some clarifying questions. And you know what, if you can answer them, great. If you can't, don't worry about it. We'll figure it out. It's part of our job. You want to support that child. You provide support for the child. If there are any supportive services at the school that you have them talk to the school counselor. Those kind of services can be provided. Do not ask them any more questions. As I mentioned earlier, do not discuss the situation with anyone until the investigation concludes. We need to be able to go through with a kind of a clean environment to get all this information, and just keep it to yourselves. Can you describe an unusual case? Well, I'm going to have to think about that, because I have never been an ER social worker. Somewhat.
But also, I think to get through, we could save that for the end and maybe cut short some of the FAQs. I wanted to add, we say don't ask the child any more questions. Now, if the child has disclosed to you and feels safe with you, they may come back to you to talk.
Yes.
Your role would be to listen. If you hear of any new information to add to your report, then you would call back Children and Family Services. What we mean here is you're not going to ask them for more details of what actually happened.
Right. And I think I did come up with an idea for that other question, but I do want to save that for the end. So let's go to the next slide. All right, so we're going to go in, we're going to do our investigation. Emergency social worker shows up, does their investigations. There's going to be one of three outcomes. Either the allegation is substantiated, so that means that it's more than likely has occurred based on the evidence. Inconclusive means there wasn't enough evidence to determine if it has actually occurred. So inconclusive is a tough one, because it's like we can't say for sure, but the good thing is the information's there. Unfounded is it did not happen and it was inherently improbable. So that's the one that most families like to hear, because that is a good outcome. Inconclusive, that doesn't mean that it did happen or it didn't happen. It just means we didn't have enough evidence, but that stuff is in the system. So if another call comes through, it's building up those, as I call them, red flags. So those are the three outcomes.
I'd like to add an inconclusive. Sometimes it could be because the family moved and they were not able to contact the family or the suspected victim child. And so that could be a reason that they can't determine whether or not abuse has occurred.
Right. All right, so here's some statistics. West County, number of referrals, 1,063. Number of children separated, 74, so 7% of those calls. In Central County, 1311, 64 children separated, 4.9%. East County, 1830, with 96 children separated, 5.2%. Now, West and Central County are pretty much, they've grown as much as they can grow, really. East County is a growing, burgeoning area, so that's why we see higher numbers there, because there's just more people out there. And if you ever go out there, the amount of housing that's being built out there is incredible. But with Central and West, there's not a whole lot of room for that kind of growth. So that's where those numbers come from. But when you think about it, I mean, I would rather see like no kids separated, but at least, you know, this also shows you how many phone calls that we're taking, and that only 5.6% of the kids are actually being detained. So as much as it's hard to hear, a lot of our referrals get evaluated out, which means when that phone call comes in, we don't see anything that makes it rise to the level of needing an investigation. So
I'd like to add too, is that because of the population growth in East County, social safety nets have not increased with the population. So, and we can talk about like very basic things, you know, like food banks, mental health services, supportive services for families haven't caught up with the population growth. But the good news is that funders are now starting to give out grants to agencies who will expand programs into East County. So help is on the way, and we already have quite, like the Family Justice Center, for example, opened up in East County. It's happening. It's just taking a while.
yeah. So basically, the primary child welfare outcomes that we are looking at when we work with our children is safety, always first and foremost. Permanency. So if a child has to be detained, our goal is always reunification with the parents. Next, with a family member who passes the RFA process. We don't want to have kids come in and have a family member come forward and take them in only to find out that they're perpetrating more abuse, which has happened, which is why we have the new reforms. And then their well-being. We want to see kids thrive, not just survive. We want to make sure that they're in school, that they're getting their medical needs met, that they're getting their social needs met. We want kids to be able to be kids within their family first, or with a forever home if the family cannot get back to a point of being that family unit. And then here's our caveat. So, is there room in your home for one more? I can tell you that when I first came, I was the recruiter, and it was my job to get families to come through. I can tell you that we really need families. I'm going to make a pitch here because I know from 22 years in this field that when we have good families, we get good outcomes. In fact, when we were talking, it was me who said, you know, this work, I can change a child's life, but I'm going to tell you honestly, they changed my life. And our kids deserve that. So if you know anyone who has been thinking about it, or one of yourselves, please send them to our website, because it's really heartbreaking when our shelter care unit comes to us and says, we need homes and we don't have them. And then we end up, you know, looking to our nonprofits, which is great, but then we're moving kids down to Bakersfield or up to Sacramento. Makes it hard for families in reunification. So if you have any room in your home, or you know someone who does, please contact us, because when it works, it works. It works great. I can tell you, one of my kids called me last year who I worked with, and he told me when he graduated high school and he was going into the Army that his goal was to one day work in the White House. And he called me last January to tell me that he was in the communications department at the White House. You know, you don't get that kind of satisfaction from too many jobs. Granted, it's not the easiest job, but when a kid calls you and says thank you, it's a good day. So
Jamie, I want to point out to people that if they call for more information, you'd be referred to an orientation class. Like calling the number or clicking on the website doesn't like lock you into a commitment.
no,
You will just be exploring what is it like, what does it entail, and if it's something for you. So it wouldn't hurt.
no.
All right.
All
So
right.
before we get started here, as I'm looking at the clock, because it's 11:45, I want everyone in the audience to know we're not likely to get through all of these questions, but in your packets of information, all these questions are listed with full explanations. So what we don't get to, you'll be able to see in your packets with the answer to the question.
So when am I a mandated reporter? All of the time? Actually, no. You are only a mandated reporter within the scope of your job duties. So if you are off work, technically, you don't have to report any suspected abuse. Now, morally is a totally different story. And I know that 6 months ago, I was at home and I heard screaming, and I wasn't sure where it came from. And I called the sheriffs. And it turns out that my neighbor, their daughter, who was, I think, schizophrenic, was having a meltdown. Not a comfortable feeling, but at that time, it just sounded like someone was being murdered. You got to make the phone call. And it worked out. She got the help she needed. So you don't have to outside of the scope of your duties, but I would hope that morally you would feel compelled to make the call, because as we've stated here, a child needs us to step up. We can't ignore this because it's getting bad, and I'd really like to be put out of a job.
Right. I would just like to add, if you're a mandated reporter and you're off the clock, but you're volunteering in your professional capacity, for example, you're a teacher who volunteers on Sundays to teach religious studies to children while their parents attend a service. You're acting like a teacher. That is your professional capacity. At that time, you are a mandated reporter. However, if you're a teacher and you're volunteering to selling hot dogs at your son's Little League game, you are not in your professional capacity because you don't sell hot dogs for a living. You would not be considered a mandated reporter for that. It's when you're volunteering within the scope of your profession that you would be required, when you're off the clock, to report.
All right. So the reporting hotline. So can you call us and ask for advice if you're not sure? You can absolutely call us. We can't legally tell you whether or not to make the report. But through dialogue and questions and answers, you'll probably get a pretty clear picture of whether you should or should not. We can sometimes tell you that it does not meet the level that would cause us to go out and investigate. But make the phone call, because I always tell people this: when you make that phone call, find out who you spoke to and then write down what they said. Because if someone calls you the next day and says, "Did you make a report?" you can say, "Well, I called and this is what I came up with." You always want to keep track of who you've spoken to. So CFS will take your report, because reasonable suspicion is all you need to make that report. Again, it is up to us here at CFS to do the investigative part, which is why we tell you, once you make your report, you do not have to investigate. We will do that. And yes, we will let you know the outcome of the report. You can ask for that, and when we're done, we will let you know. Now, what I do know from my colleague who does a lot of after hours, don't expect that you're going to get that outcome like within a week. It could take a while, because sometimes if we've got a lot of cases, getting that information back to you could take a couple of weeks and maybe a month. So, but you know what? I would say, give us a call. We'll figure out how to answer the question for you. But yes, we will let you know.
I would just, oh no, you're going to stress this on the next one, next slide. We're very lucky in Contra Costa County to have Children and Family Services to call and consult with if you're confused. So you can start documenting, consult your peers, consult CFS. Those are ways you can help yourself come to reasonable suspicion when you're sitting on the fence. Other counties don't do that. You either call to report or you don't call them at all. So, I want to commend our county for being a support to mandated reporters.
All right, so legal guidelines that we have to follow. Basically, and I mentioned this earlier, we follow the welfare and institution codes, and those are 300 codes A through J. And these are the list of criteria that our workers have to present to take this to court. So we investigate, we determine if it's physical abuse, sexual abuse, and they all match up to the codes. Then we go to court, and it's at the court where the court decides if we have jurisdiction and if we can detain the child. Sometimes because of maybe a safety concern, the child comes in, they go to court 2 days later, and things have worked out and the kid goes home. But it's the judge who says, send them home or detain them. And again, remember that you only have to have reasonable suspicion to report the abuse, but we have to follow state law in order to detain a child. So while some people think we walk into a home and detain a child, we actually don't even have the jurisdiction to do that. There's usually a police call, and then we go to court. So we don't have just the legal rights to go in and just take a child. We have to prove our case in a court of law. So questioning children. So when a child comes to you and discloses, you want to be sure to ask open-ended questions. So these are questions that can't be answered with a yes or no. I notice you have a bruise. How did that happen? As opposed to, I notice you have a bruise. Did your father do that to you? You cannot ask leading questions. You seem angry when I ask that question. Sometimes it's best to let the kids respond. Like, don't give them a reason to answer in a certain way, because a lot of times if they're coming to you, they do want to talk. At another point, you can ask more closed-ended questions. So those can be yes or no, but these are kind of, again, factual questions. So, oh, I can answer that in a little minute here. When did this happen? Has this happened before? If so, when? And then where did it happen? We want to be, again, careful not to put ideas into children's heads. We have our CIC office that does a lot of interviewing of children, and these people are trained, because court cases can be made or lost if you ask a leading question, or you're found to have asked, well, your dad did this to you, right? And the kid's like, well, you cannot make a kid give an answer that fits your need. We want the children to be able to answer honestly. So no leading questions.
In terms of a leading question, an example that I like to give is, you wouldn't even ask a child if you see that they have a bruise, does that bruise hurt? Because haven't we all had bruises that didn't hurt if we didn't poke at them? And it's suggestive to a child. The child go, oh, bruises, I guess they should hurt. And all of a sudden they may say, yeah, it really hurts, when it doesn't. So you don't, even that's a leading question.
Yeah.
Another thing that one of our colleagues says that I think is important is that when the child, like with the open-ended question, where they're giving you their story, their narrative, it's really important that you not pull out a pen and a paper and start taking notes. You have to do the best you can to remember everything they've told you, because you're pulling out the pen and the paper can frighten a child and make them shut down.
Yes.
So as best you can, sit at their level, reassure them that they have done the right thing in talking to you or into telling you. And just listen and try to remember as best you can. And then oh, go ahead, Jamie.
I think you also want to remind yourself to be present. And I don't want to quite say poker face, but you know, some of these kids could be telling you stuff that's going to be hard for you to hear. And you have to be mindful to watch your response. If a child came in and told you that their father has been molesting them and it's graphic, you don't want to like blanch at what they say. You need to be present. You need to hear what they have to say. You need to be empathetic. If your phone rings, don't answer it. You know, they need your complete focus because this is a huge trust situation and you don't want to break that trust with children.
And Jamie, could you talk about what to do when a child asks a mandated reporter to keep a secret?
So when they ask you that, you can basically say that you can't keep secrets in certain situations. When I would meet kids that I worked with, it was always, you know, whatever you say to me is between us unless it's something where you're going to be hurt or your safety is at risk. So they want you to keep it a secret, but secrets is what got them there. So you just want to reassure them that you have to tell people about what is going on when it's basically a threat to their health and safety. And kids understand that, but they always ask probably because their parents have taught them about keeping secrets. Should I report third-party knowledge of suspected child abuse or neglect? Third-party reporting is required if the third party is given reasonable suspicion child abuse has occurred and cannot verify the report that's already been made. So yeah, again, err on the side of caution. The third party has to have identifying information to give to CFS so they can make that determination. However, we do prefer to hear from the mandated reporter with the direct knowledge. But again, at the end of the day, it's about the safety of the children. So make that report and encourage that third party to come forward and make that report. But give us as much information as you can so that we can determine if we need to investigate.
So domestic violence, and this was referred to earlier, if the child is aware of domestic violence in their home, it is reportable as suspected child abuse. And depending on other circumstances, it would go down as emotional abuse and possibly could go down as neglect. Why is it reportable? We need to make sure that child is safe. What we know is the psychological damage it does to children to live in homes where domestic violence is in play. The child could get physically harmed if they get in between the two fighting parties, and they could be physically harmed. So we've got psychological harm, potential physical harm. And then we know statistically, people who abuse their partners, it raises the risk that they also abuse their children and also abuse their pets. So an abusive person, it raises the risk for everyone in that household.
That one's yours.
Oh, it is?
Well,
Okay.
I mean, we can both speak to it, but
there is a handout in your packets, but for you to read all about this child sex trafficking, it does happen. It's alive and well, sadly, in Contra Costa County. In some places, like in West County, it's visible. Children are actually engaged in what we used to call child prostitution, now known as child exploitation. But it happens in Central and East County in homes, cars, and hotels. It's just not seen. Does not mean it's not happening. And one of the biggest busts, child sex trafficking rings that were arrested in Contra Costa was from a very affluent area in Danville, where this couple were trafficking minors sexually for 12 years before they got caught. There are all sorts of task force around this topic, but if this is a case, and in your packets, I have a handout on when is it best to call law enforcement, when is it best to call Children and Family Services. You would want to call Children and Family Services on this one, because they have a trauma-informed, dedicated team to work with these youth and try to, so now that it's been decriminalized, so what we used to call child prostitution is no longer a crime for the youth. Studies show there's always an adult who profits. So by arresting the youth, you're re-traumatizing a victim. So now they're not going to be arrested, but Children and Family Services have been charged with trying to get these kids reunited with their family, if possible, extended family, family friend, or foster care. They are in charge of providing that child's necessities. It's a very, very difficult topic. Please do read about it, and just remember, Children and Family Services has a dedicated team around just this. So I'm looking at the clock. Do you want to answer one more and you tell me which one you want? Remember, all of the answers for our audience are typed out for you in your packets. Maybe child at home?
A child at home is a good one. So what do I do if I'm worried that a child is alone and unsafe at home? So apparently under California law, there is no specified age when a child can be left home alone. For some families, it is a financial necessity to be that latchkey kid. So you want to be careful about this, because if the child understands they're home alone, that they have phone numbers so that they know how to contact their parents, that might be okay. You want to ask them, you know, who would you call, how would you call, and how would you know whether you're safe? I mean, for a lot of kids, it's don't answer the door. If someone phones the house and your parents aren't there, you never say mom and dad aren't here. You say they're busy, can I take a message? So if they answer those questions correctly, and again, you're looking at their overall demeanor, then they're probably okay, because it is unfortunately a fact of life. But if they tell you that they're afraid, and you can see that there's a real fear that they're home alone, then you might want to call law enforcement and have them check into that. You can have them conduct a health and safety check, because it could be that the parents don't know that they're afraid. We don't know. But again, it always points to making sure a child is safe and cared for.
Burden in situations like this is on the parent. You have to have a health and safety plan in place for your child. So it stands to reason that very young children could never follow a health and safety plan. And it is a financial necessity, but if something bad happens, there could be, the family might be looked at for neglect.
Yeah.
There are things that are not reasonable, like parents should not expect a 12-year-old to inject their 10-year-old brother with insulin. They shouldn't go away gambling for the weekend, leaving home like a 6 and a 4-year-old. So even though there's no age on the books in the state of California, parents have the burden of knowing that their children are
Safe.
ready.
Yes.
And that they can handle it.
Years ago, where a couple went out of the state and left the 2 kids home alone with phone numbers, but they left the state and they got in trouble because it was like both the kids were under 10 and they weren't doing so well by themselves, let's just say. So someone had a question about unique criteria on an ER call. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask that question again? Because I want to make sure I understand exactly what you're asking.
I want to add, since it's noon, to be respectful to our guests, we're going to hang around and answer questions, but you please feel free to leave the training if it's lunchtime, or no, feel free to leave, but feel free to stay is what I'm saying.
Thank you for coming.
Yes.
So we're open for questions.
And Jamie, I interrupted you. What were you saying before I just
Well,
called the
someone
clock?
had asked a question about a unique circumstance with ER workers. And I just wanted some more clarification because, you know, the ER workers, you know, their job is to go out to the home. Kirsten, at the bottom, possibly the top of your screen where you see your little microphone, there should be a button that says unmute.
While they're doing that, I wanted to, Miranda asked if she could get a certificate. And then Shannon replied from Family Justice Center, they're going to get the PowerPoint handout and the training materials. I just want to say, anyone that would like a certificate, if you contact me and you will have my email address, I would be more than happy to send you a certificate of participation. It's not going to count for continuing education units, but I can issue you a certificate.
Hi, Kirsten. I see you're on the. Oh, hello.
Okay, now I can. I don't. Oh, can you see me? Oh,
Yeah, I can hear you.
I can't
Yay.
see you, but I can
got a
hear you.
mute permission. So, going back to my questions, I know that I've been through extended trainings on child abuse and ER work. I'm just wondering, can you give us like an unusual case where you found this, I guess, affecting you emotionally and just hard to handle per se, you know?
Oh yeah. Gosh, I was very fortunate. It wasn't until 13 years in somewhere. I actually had a case where the father in one of my homes perpetrated on the son of one of my other homes. They were friends, family friends. And we come to find out that he had been perpetrating on the boy, which pretty much almost drove me out of the business because I'm going into these homes and I'm asking the questions and making sure the girls are safe because this family had girls. And then we found out that he had been stockpiling sleep medication and would put sleep medication in his daughter's drink and this little boy's drink, but he would molest the boy. And then after the fact, the foster parent of the boy, well, he was actually adopted at that point, had said he'd started having sleep problems. He started sleepwalking and there was a lot of angst and aggression that she couldn't figure out where it came from. Well, he, in his little mind, thought something was wrong too. So he stopped drinking the juice that this guy was giving them. And he woke up during his being molested. This 9-year-old had the wherewithal to pretend he was still asleep, got up and ran home and told his parents. They called us, child abuse report, called the police. And it was a difficult one because he was a Mr. Mom. Like it really kind of rocked the city they were in because he helped out at school. And, this whole time I'm asking the girls, do you feel safe? And it never occurred to ask about boys because there were no boys in the home. It was devastating for me because this other family, they were both good families, but this other family was one of my favorites. They had 7 kids in their home. They were that kind of foster family that you just wish you could clone. And I literally almost quit. CCL came out, and what kind of helped me was it was a veteran investigator, and she looked at my case notes and looked at everything, and she's like, don't do this to yourself. These are pedophiles. They are very good at what they do. And everything that you have in your notes, everything you did was there. There was no way you could know. And even the other parent was like, no, don't do this to yourself. And so I was able to support them. And the gentleman went to jail. His wife left him and took her child and left the state. That was a hard one. And it doesn't happen a lot where it affects you in that way, because this was 2 of my homes that were friends. So we all felt a little duped, but you do what you have to do and you move on. He went to jail, not for near as long as I think he should have. But, you know, it's just a reminder sometimes that for me that, you know, we always, like, we talk about stranger danger, that look for that person that looks bad. This guy never would have thought. I mean, the people at the school were like, what? Because sometimes the people that are doing things to our kids, they don't look mean. They don't look dirty. They are clergy, coaches, people they trust. That's why it's important to have conversations with your kids and believe them when they tell you something's wrong. Because a lot of times, go ahead.
I was just looking, there's a great video all about Jenna, I think it's called. And I have, it's a CD and a DVD, and I've got it. And with sexual predators, you know, it's not the guy in the overcoat, scruffy, smelly, you know, like what we would think a pedophile might look like. And in this video, this pedophile groomed the whole family for 5 years before he started perpetrating. And the girl hesitated to come forward when it finally happened when she was 16, because that's dad's best friend. We go on vacation together. The parents had like absolutely no clue. And the daughter was too afraid to speak up. And of course, he was threatening her too. So yes, quite sadly, sexual predators can be very handsome, very, you know, there are female predators, but mainly it's men, and they're very, you know, good looking, charming, maybe even successful. Like the story Jamie told, the guy had a prominent position in the town he lived in. You just can never see it coming. So we just have to empower children with the lies that perpetrators will tell them, and say, they're going to say this to you and they're going to say that to you, and just know it's not true. That's our best way, other than being hyper vigilant of who's in our lives, or maybe thinking more critically about who's in our lives. But it's empowering the children that's really going to make a difference, I think, in a big way.
Yeah. Did that help, Kirsten? I know. Now I'm all depressed. No, I'm just kidding.
No, it's nice to get feedback from somebody who's out there in the field doing it. Because
yeah,
when you learn it on papers and books, it's not the same thing. So
yeah, it's, you know, it's not the easiest job. People have asked me over the years how I do this work, and my only response is how do I not? Somebody's gotta speak up for the kids. And as hard as it is, though, I've been blessed to have so much more positive from this work than negative. But there are days where sometimes I don't know if I like people so much. Individuals, yes. I would love to see the need for people like me to not be there. But I don't see the situation getting better. But that's why it's so important for all of us to do this training and to understand how valuable it is for mandated reporters to really step up, as scary as it can be, because it can be, but the kids need us. Any other questions while we're still here?
All right, Shannon.
All right.
Thank you for being an awesome facilitator and checking chat. Thank you, Jamie.
You're welcome.
I love our collaboration. And someone has a question.
Oh, okay.
15 or 11. Oh, she had a question in the chat. So like, let's see what it is.
See if we can see which one it is. Can you unmute Eve and ask it? Oh, I can't see.
Have recommendations for what to do, like in the example of hearing screaming in your neighborhood that does not involve the police.
Well, okay, so I'm going to go back to the night I was at my house and I heard screaming in my neighborhood, and where the way my house is situated. Oh, hi, Eve. My house is a tiny house behind a bigger house, and there's a lot of land, and then there's other houses. So when I heard the screaming, I couldn't even tell where it came from. Like I didn't know if it was the house in front of me or one of the houses across the street, but it wasn't one scream. It was a couple of screams, and it sounded like someone was kind of half fighting or being harmed. When you hear that, the only thing you can do is call the police. The sheriffs will come out and they will check on the situation. Now, in my case, I told them when they got there that I worked for Children and Family Services, and hope they didn't even come back and tell me what happened, which I thought was a little annoying. And then the next morning, I heard an ambulance come and go. So I thought the father had been sick, but then my neighbor across the street came out and said they took her away. They 5150'd the daughter because she was having basically a breakdown due to her schizophrenia. And I just said, oh, okay. And then I did meet the girl's mother, who actually hadn't been living with them, and they came down and she mentioned, she started talking to me about the daughter and all her issues. And I'm like, oh, okay. Because I sure as heck wasn't going to tell them that I made the phone call. But I did tell her, where I worked, and she was asking for services. And I think I actually told them to get the green book, the Surviving Parenthood. Surviving Parenthood is a great book, but it's hard. But
so this is our the resource directory our agency publishes, and this is the latest edition. It's the 15th edition. Don't be fooled by the word parenthood. It's a resource that's how it started. So it's the traditional name, but it's a resource directory for everyone. And we just added a section of resources for human trafficking. So everything's been updated. Another great resource in terms of like helping families, as I said, anything we can do to reduce the risk in a family's life as a step towards child abuse prevention would be 211. You can dial 211 anywhere in California, and you will get the county you're in's resource line. And you can say to them, I have a family, or I know of a family and they're really poor and they could use food, but they do have a kitchen. Then they can line you up with resources in that person's area, so that you're not sending someone from Richwood for resources out in Brentwood, for example. And they will give you local places that family can go to. So in terms of helping others, those are two, our directory. It comes in English and Spanish. It's free. Just contact us. We'll send you one. If you're an organization and you want a whole box, you can have a whole box, but then we'd ask you to come to our office and pick up. And then don't forget, and 211 also has a website that you can navigate. I think it's just 211.org, and then you'd have to put in the zip code that you want. And that's another way to get resources for families. And when you see abuse out in public, what can you do? I mean, it's hard to report if you don't know the child's name or the family's name, right? So there's a couple of things you can do. If you're in the store, try to diffuse the situation with some humor and go, oh, kids, boy, they could drive you crazy. Even if the child's not driving them crazy, you can say something like that just to take some steam out of the situation. You can approach the store manager. Maybe that parent used a credit card when they made purchases, and then we'd have a way to track the kid and the parent. The only thing you shouldn't do is show signs of anger and disgust, because that's just not going to go over well. Or you could say, you look like you're struggling. Can you use some help? Just don't approach an angry parent who's abusing their kid with anger, as much as that may be what we feel, because that's not a way that they're not going to hear that.
No, they're going to.
And then if you can get the license plate number, that's another thing.
So Eve, did that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, I think I was also just like curious, as like social workers who have been in the field for a long time, if I don't know, you have like some like dreams or hopes for the future where police will not be involved as I don't know, in the way that we're relying on them now. Like in the example that you gave, it was like a mental health crisis, and I could see how a social worker may have approached that differently than the police would.
Yeah, and it does kind of seem like we might be moving towards that. Again, over the years, sometimes police are not the best. And other times I've worked with police officers who have handled situations well. But I know there was a certain city a long time ago where the kid was struggling, let's say, acting out. And the police response to that was they should open up a can of whoop on him. And I just remember thinking, really, because that's not going to work. But then I've worked with other police officers who are very understanding. I think our police officers need more training in understanding trauma and how to work in these situations. Because I get it's a stressful job, but you know what? So is social work. It's actually listed as one of the most stressful jobs. I mean, because you can go into people's homes and you're just trusting that they're going to treat you okay. And so, you have to be quick on your feet. You got to learn how to diffuse situations. I know in my career, I have found that working with compassion and courtesy, even with bio parents in the past, has worked far better than judgment. People are struggling, and if you can come with them and hear them, you'd be amazed at how hard they will work to try to do better by their kids, because most of the time they will look at you as you're coming in to judge them, to lord over them, to be, the powerful Oz. And that's not how I work. I do tell people that my job is to let them know when they're doing something wrong or stupid, but I always do it with respect. And I have been blessed, like I said, to have a really positive career with my families and my kids. And my kids have taught me so much. I would never trade a moment with them, even on their worst days. And that's a big deal for our kids because we are in a very judgy society. And building trust is, I think, the foundation of doing this work well. Not always easy, but we try.
I've done mandated reporter trainings. And when I come to cultural considerations and I say that spanking is considered a cultural custom for discipline and it is not against the law, I had this group stand up and cheer and said if more parents did that, we wouldn't be as busy as we are. And I was with a social worker on that training, and as we left, our jaws were just like, because we said it is legal, but we talk about parenting in a different way, a more effective way. We don't encourage it. The American Academy of Pediatrics doesn't encourage it, but when they were cheering and interrupting the training because they were so happy it was legal, that was probably like the worst training in 17 years that I walked away like, oh my God.
Power and control is not where you want to start from in parenting. It's not going to work.
I'm sorry to interrupt the discussion, but we're hitting 12:20.
Okay.
And I have, unfortunately, another meeting to go to.
Okay.
Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, Family Justice Center.
Yeah, thank you guys very much for allowing us to come.
Yes.
You're very welcome. And let's continue the collaboration. It's so needed. And thank you, everyone, for your participation. And please know that we offer other trainings too and are happy to offer those to you as well. In the meantime, everybody have a wonderful Friday and a productive weekend.
You too.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Shannon.
You're welcome.